My name is Wriju and I work at Microsoft as a cloud solution architect. So my day-to-day job is to help enterprises move their workload into cloud, right? So that's the primary job. Everything else is the side work. So I'm going to talk about what I experienced closing down few data centers for large customers globally and have gathered a few pointers, which is sort of common across different segments. When I say segments, it could be banking solution, it could be oil and energy, healthcare, it could be CPG, that is consumer product manufacturing. So everybody today are now closing down their on-premises data center, either hired data center, rented data center, or their own data center. And now they are moving into cloud, right? And because I work for Microsoft, my predominant experience is moving those workloads into Azure. So I try to make this presentation pretty generic, keeping in mind that you might be doing migration for other cloud, but sometimes I might give you references which is very specific to Azure, right? So bear with me for those issues. And I made this slide in such a way that you can also refer those things, and I kind of have recorded that, so just in case you want to review it, you can always watch it. In fact, we are getting it recorded here as well, so everything will be for you, and this slide will be available for you to use it later. I want to start with this picture, okay? A bit of art history. So Piet Mondrian, right? Mondrian is the Dutch artist, and he comes from an age called Harlem School. And Harlem School is the age of painting when Dutch painters reached their peak of doing the landscape painting. If you have liked any landscape painting, I'm sure 99% that is a Dutch painting, okay? That's how it is. And he comes from that background, that's his training, okay? That's how he got trained in Harlem. He's been living in Netherlands for quite some time, then he moved to Paris. And then he got influenced by Picasso and about Cubism, and he started drawing few paintings in Cubist pattern. But then he changed everything drastically. And he came up with this basic structure of painting, right? And you'll find this painting across. There are, even last week I went to a Nike showroom, I saw a t-shirt and a shoe like this. That's definitely the Mondrian's influence, right? What I essentially want to bring in here as a discussion is that when you do any cloud migration, there are people who are pro-migration, there are people who are anti-migrations. So you have to stand up in that crowd and say, we can do that, okay? You will get a lot of pushback from businesses, from IT, from the people who are managing application, because for them it's additional work, right? So like Piet Mondrian, we have to come up with something which is very simple and doable, right? That's what my analogy here is. So it is not related to Azure or cloud migration. This is just an idea that at 1937, a painter like Piet, who got trained in Dutch landscape, which used to get sold across the globe at a high price, did not really continue that training, but came up with this, which never sold during his lifetime with a high price. He really got into trouble with a lot of issues, right? He died later point in time in, I think, New Year, but later part of his life was pretty okay. But what I mean to say is that he thought about it, right? And you will find a lot of influences today with many designers using his pattern. In fact, there are tiles available in the market. You will find like this. You will find dresses, shoes. You will find building designs also. In Netherlands, you will find many building designs like this. And he uses basic color, RGB, and yellow. So he doesn't mix the color, two or more colors. He uses basic color, and this is how he comes up with most of his later part of the drawing. Now, what we need in any cloud migration is essentially few things, okay? Before you really think about it, is that do you really have the money to do that? Because anytime you move something, it's not just about moving a box, okay? It is moving a lot of things, right? So you need to have an enterprise level strategy, whether your enterprise is ready to move to cloud. If enterprise says that we will not move to cloud, we will stay on premises. Even if you try to show something which is extremely interesting, will not work. Because that's not the strategy of their company, right? So when it is not a strategic thing, you will not have the budget allocation for those workload to be moving, right? So how do we do that if we don't have man hours available to pay for, right? And then a team of people. So architects, designers, they come up with an idea of how it should approach. But ultimately somebody needs to write. Somebody needs to put it in DevOps. Somebody needs to change the code if it is required, right? Somebody needs to actually deliver these things. So we need to call them as a delivery team. So it's a team effort at the end of the day, right? So you need a rock solid team to not only move things, but also maintain and manage after the movement is done, right? How do you switch over from on-premises to the cloud? That's something you need to have, right? So these are the three major things I can think of before you really start digging deeper into any cloud migration discussion. If you do not have any one of them, you should not proceed unless these three pillars are available with you, right? That's my experience, because we started with no budget, thinking that someday there will be budget because they have a cloud strategy, but it never happened. We only drew things in the whiteboard and then came up with a design idea, but it never flew because there was no budget, never was a budget, and the business was actually getting closed. That's why there was no budget. So you have to make sure that even if there is an enterprise strategy, you still should have a budget allocated for that specific activity. Now there are many challenges. I will not talk about challenges. My job is to provide solutions, right? So I will only highlight them to provide the further solutions, right? So I will just highlight a few of the challenges with the current. If you assume that you are working with a customer who has on-premises application base, there are certain things which you need to take care of. And I will highlight this legacy application. By legacy means it could be any kind of application which runs today on-premises. It could be a desktop-based application, console exe-based application. Application could be a web-based like ASP.NET or Java application running on the virtual machines in the on-premises. There could be licensed application. Now it's a complex thing because you might have purchased proprietary software from a company who says that you can only install it once. Okay, that's the license agreement you have, right? If you have to move that to cloud, you have to switch that and then deploy it somewhere in the cloud so that you can maintain that agreement of having a single license. So that's the complexity of a legacy license product which is purchased. And then custom application. So this is easy bit because generally you are the owner of the source code. You can go and change things at the source code level, and then you can go ahead and make things really work pretty quickly. It also creates challenges when you have a legacy application, custom application built 15 years ago and developer left the company. Okay, I've seen Pro-C application talking to Oracle database written 15 years ago, and there is no developer who can write C today in that team. Okay, so which means that they changed the Oracle version to 19C and it is not working because there's a driver missing and nobody can write a simple hello world kind of application to talk to the Oracle database because there is no skill set available in that team anymore. Even with the source code, you're still in trouble, right? And then a lot of this custom application needs a lot of documentation, which sometimes it is a tribal knowledge, we call it, right? It stays within the team, and if the team is kind of moved outside of the company, then it's gone. And sometimes you hire a vendor to do that, and you terminate the contract after a couple of years, then you don't have that skill set with you because you will never did that development, though you own the source code, right? So those are the things. And WCF and Windows services are predominantly used in many different aspects, especially with this scheduler kind of job where there are things which runs in the background. Let's say you get a file uploaded, and then you process the file back the background. It's done generally with the Windows service. Sometimes you need to expose certain services to WCF. WCF doesn't work in cloud like as is. So you see that these are the legacy application bits. Beyond that, you have legacy platform component like your old operating system. So I've seen companies running their workload in Windows 2012 and they are scared to change the operating system because they have to go through a regression testing of 25 days. And there's a watch time also if you change the inline, anything in that. So you basically have the legacy operating system which is not very easy to change. Legacy databases is the same thing like legacy operating system and legacy runtime like ASP.NET 1.1. So I've seen that still running, working fine, so nobody is bothered to touch. But when a cloud migration happens, that's the point where we discover all these things. Now, legacy continues, which means that you have things like Windows Server Active Directory, which is pretty common in every organization, most of the organizations today, which means there are applications which is using Windows authentication for authentication purpose. They might be using LDAP queries for web-based application, which is again a legacy way of interacting with Active Directory. You have a SAN storage for storing things, which is pretty common on premises, and then you have DMZ concept to hide the traffic from the internal data center, zone defined, where it is connected to internet and the rest of the data center is probably disconnected, right? So these are the legacy components which you typically see in any kind of discovery model for any on-premises application base. Now these are the problems, common problems. There are many problems. I can talk about only problems, but these are common problems I've seen, the challenges I've seen in the cloud kind of scenario where there's a cloud migration required. Now there could be many different solutions, but I have kind of highlighted which worked for me personally, right? So I kind of created a OneNote for all these things, right, for a longer period of time, so I captured these details from there. Is that when you work for any kind of cloud migration, remember that you are working for a specific industry. Could be a healthcare specific industry, because the application probably targets an audience and does some specific business. It could be in healthcare, it could be banking, it could be anything of that sort. So when you go into somebody else's data center, you need those compliance certifications for those data center to comply with the business standard. Okay? That's the ultimate thing. So if you are healthcare, you need a HIPAA compliance. Straightforward. Without HIPAA compliance, you can't really move. You can't really get an approval from within your InfoSec team. They will stop you. How to do that? So many cloud vendors, they do provide certifications, which is aligned to many different businesses. So to make sure they do exist, right? Which means that it is the ultimate information you need at the very beginning to decide whether this cloud is right or that cloud is right. So the choice of your cloud really depends on whether that cloud is ready for your industry, target industry, which you are targeting, right? That's what I'm talking about, compliance. And information security, which means that what happens when things go wrong is something which you need to start thinking about from the day zero, right? If an incident occurs, how do you do a threat hunting? How do you go back and do the post-mortem of your incident cycle, right? What is the mechanism available today? How do you integrate with that mechanism? Because you can't really change everything overnight. If you imagine that you have a legacy SIM solution already running in your organization, you probably have to tap to that solution. And how to do that, right? What is the guideline in terms of like whether you should be able to allow external traffic to access your application or not, and if yes, then how, right? So these are the kind of information security discussion you need to have. So every large organization I have seen that they bring in their security architect from the day one to have that conversation so that you don't miss out anything. Imagine that an oil and energy company today does a small glitch in their application because of which the data of their customer goes out, they probably have to end up paying billions of dollars. Whereas having that InfoSec, probably a few $1,000 man-hour expenditure for them, right? So that's the impact. And that's why it is so important for anything in cloud to have that conversation at the early on. And it is different from on-premises, because on-premises you trust your data center, you say that everything is in this room, I don't allow people to enter, so everything is secure, it's not connected to internet. Everybody who is in my network is using that, doesn't allow. So it kind of very easy to say that it's protected, right? Though it is not theoretically, but it is easy to say. But in cloud, you don't know where the data center is. Where if you say that I'm using Azure in South India is typically Chennai, but you don't know where that building is, exact location of the building, right? So how do you make sure that it's protected? How it is protected? So all this SOC 2 type 2 compliance and then all this HIPAA compliance, these all talk about that. And these compliance certifications are done by third-party auditors like Deloitte and all these big companies who generally are master in doing this auditing, and they certify after an observation period of more than 6 months. So they observe it. And there is a policy of allowing them to go inside the data center, talk to many different people who manage the data center, and then they come up with that service. So it's like that authority that yes, it's kind of following all the standards and things like that. Now, for any application, it's not just about C# or .NET or Python or Java. It's also about the business. So you need a business architect to understand the business. And then obviously the ops. Ops means what happens when an application is ready for production, right? Your job doesn't end there because things can go wrong even if it is in production. So who will manage that? How do you hand over that knowledge to a separate team who are not part of the development to make sure that if there is a small change required, it will be done quickly, effectively, and if there is onboarding required, if there is a change request, how the change request will happen. Because it will be maintained for more than a couple of years. Just because that application is built, it doesn't go away in few years, right? So it will generally stay for a couple of years. So you need to have that seamless collaboration. So we call that ops integration in a couple of companies as co-pilot. So we bring them into our development phase. We ask them to come with us, stay with us so that they can learn how things are being handled. And when we hand over the document, and imagine that you can write good document but nobody reads it. Okay, it's only for people to have the documentation, but that knowledge of doing things really helps, right? So that's co-pilot really helps in this kind of journey. Now this is very important, and I've seen in initial days people are skipping that. Now how Azure works. You go into Azure, you say that I get a subscription, you pay through a credit card or you pay through an enterprise contract, either way, you get a subscription. You are free to deploy anything and everything over there. Now that's not how enterprise works. What they really need to do is that they need to really do something to make it their own cloud, which means that if I talk about healthcare, they'll make sure that all the possible thing which is allowed in the healthcare is allowed, rest are not allowed. So we call it sometimes as whitelisting, blacklisting. So what all services you can use. So if that mandates that you need to have SOC 2 type 2 compliance for all the services you can use in production, all the non-SOC 2 type 2 compliance services like preview product features or services which is new, pretty much doesn't have SOC 2 type 2 will be blacklisted. So you cannot really go ahead and create a resource. So those are done in Azure through policies. So you can deploy policies that you can only create XYZ kind of resources in XYZ kind of regions. So those are the things you kind of try to restrict. So in the business, let's say in Europe, it is important that you follow the GDPR standard. So your data should stay in the European region. So if it is in the Western Europe, that is Amsterdam, so that's where the data center will be. So how do you not allow people to create a virtual machine in Singapore for the Europe deployment, right? So that's the kind of landing zone I'm talking about. The benefit is that like a stadium. So think of you have a team of players going to play a match. It could be a cricket or football. You don't build the stadium on the day of the match, right? The stadium has to be built for you. And the benefit of having that kind of stadium is that you can play n number of matches even after that or during that. You can have split of matches like Wimbledon is multiple stadiums right within the same boundary. So it's like that. So you build that landing zone well before the tournament. And all the application can go there. 50% of the compliance guideline is met. So as an application owner, your life is easy. You don't really need to think about on-premises kind of discussion where every server matters, all these things. It is by design. So when you get a subscription for your enterprise application, your half job is done. That's why landing zone is so important. And it also controls how you can access, who can access, how things will be exposed, etc. Right? And then what is your identity management solution strategy, right? So do you want to do business-to-business integration? That means if you have a vendor, do you want to allow them to use their own credential and invite them in your Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, I mean to say, or do you want to onboard them as a vendor employee and giving them your domain access? So what is the strategy? So a lot of companies I work, they don't allow B2B. I don't know the reason, but their policy says that they will not allow B2B. So if they work with a vendor XYZ, they will bring them into as their employee, as a vendor employee, create a different user ID and password, and allow them access. Similarly, B2C can be done, right? So for example, if you have a consumer application, you allow them to use Facebook, Yahoo, Twitter, all these logins, you bring them into Active Directory and further validate, right? So when they sign up using their credential. You don't store their credential, but you make sure that they are one of your consumers. So B2C. Now, how those applications will be used? Is it an external facing application like a public website? Or is it for internal employee portal like an HR web or payroll system? Right? Depending on that, you need to say that I will not allow any public IP address for this application. And that's what is the definition you can define in the cloud landing zone. So in cloud landing zone, you can say that internal only application will be in this kind of subscription, and internal plus external application will be this kind of. And anything which is purely public doesn't need to have an internal access to any of the sources internally available will be in this kind of landing zone. So you define those stadiums, so like a football stadium, cricket stadium, so there are different kind of stadium, right, because of the different kind of match. Right? So you need to have that cloud landing zone. Any given point, if you find the cloud landing zone is not present, you have to step back. And I have done that. You have to step back and put an effort to build that first. Because if you don't build it, in my experience, you will still be able to deploy, but it will not fly well. Because there could be an incident and you will be blamed for that. So it is so important that you have that landing zone present. And I think what I'm talking about is probably a couple of years ago. Now most of the mature organization has their cloud landing zone in the way they want it to be used, right? That's the main thing which we talked about. Now, solutions regarding backup and DR. Now any on-premises solution today has a backup and a disaster recovery available. Now this is one thing everybody wants to move to cloud. When they move to cloud, they also say what happens to my backup and DR. My answer is simple. For every cloud, any cloud you use, backup and DR is just a click away. Use those services rather than bringing your server, which is created for backup and disaster recovery on premises. Don't lift and shift, replicate the same thing as is in the cloud, because you are not leveraging the power of the cloud there. Because for us in the cloud, DR is just creating another deployment. And most of the time you can have a passive DR, because if the RPO says a specific number, which means that if they say that I can go down for 24 hours, no problem. I can wait for 24-hour data loss, no problem. You can probably trigger a DevOps pipeline to deploy it in another region if there is a region failure. Now, one of the challenges with cloud with this kind of setup is that a lot of time auditor asks for the DR test report. Okay? And when they ask for a DR test report, you can't really bring down one Azure region and test the DR. Right? It's not possible. Practically. I have faced these questions many times. Can you shut down Europe, Western Europe? We just want to test the DR. No. Because it's shared by many customers. So you have to bring some way of really producing these things, right? So that's something we have to have a negotiation with your auditors to make them understand that it's a public cloud, hence we can't do that. Probably you can take some automated approach of deleting a network or deleting a virtual machine, just like that, through some scripts, and try to see if that DR strategy is really responding. That means it's deployed in North Europe or not, right? And as I said, that backup is now available as service in all the cloud. Use that. Do not need a backup server at all. And I have done cost analysis. That means they have given me what is there on premises in this Excel file and asked me, can you put things corresponding to Azure? And I straight away strike those backup servers, saying that there is no need for this server to move there. There is no need for a couple of other different kinds of servers which are coming, but backup server is not required to move, because we have a backup solution available. Use that backup solution, which is cloud native and gives you an ability to have an automated HA available internally, right? And then high availability, as I said, like you can make highly available applications pretty quickly and easily. For a couple of instances, like for a single VM-based legacy application, when it's a proprietary software, right, works in only one virtual machine, it's not a distributed, you'll probably go in a vertical scaling. That means you increase the capacity, X number of CPU, X amount of RAM, and that increases the capacity. That's the scaling, and that's a slider. For cloud, you can just automate it. Okay? Same thing with the horizontal, which means that if you have a distributed application, you probably create multiple copies. Today you may have 2 copies. Tomorrow, if the load increases, you create 5 more copies. And those copies are not for you to create manually. It is just an option given either in the portal or automation for you to increase that number. You can do that through DevOps also. So you can say that today I need 5 instances of my app services. That's all. And it will be done for you. It's so easy, right? And it can be a performance based or on demand, as I said, like, which means that you don't have a predictable load defined for your application. In those cases, you can have a auto scale. But in my opinion, so far doing so many migrations, I have not seen auto scale enabled for any application. It is always manual because at the end of the day, it is a cost. I'm not sure about the large application like Netflix and Amazon, how they do it. But for the typical enterprise application, it's not auto scale. It is always on demand. You need to raise, you would probably have a monitoring mechanism in place which says that it's being used 80%, and you get triggered, alert comes in, and you take a decision from a board level, from that stakeholder perspective to increase the capacity, and you go and increase the capacity. So it has to have a manual intervention because at the end of the day, business needs to pay for it. It's not free, right? So that's why it is always on demand through automation. Now, database cluster. So there are databases today, and databases means it can be Oracle, it can be PostgreSQL, it can be SQL Server, any kind of database, MySQL, right? And they are generally deployed as a cluster on premises, right? Today, in most of the cloud, you can move them as a fully managed platform as a service. Benefit, you don't need any DB activity. Being an application developer or a DevOps engineer, you should be able to manage that database just by learning few things. You don't need to have 10, 15 years of experience of DB. I'm not denying that DB is not important. The DBAs are important to do optimization, performance, etc. But the typical of like 24/7, 365 days DBA presence for the database cluster, because database is the heart of the application. If the heart stops, everything stops, right? So it is a cost at the end of the day. So you can reduce that cost by moving your database into PaaS. And why enterprises are moving to cloud is because of the cost reason. If you cannot show the benefit, cost benefit, you'll probably not be able to get a buy-in from your business to move to cloud.
Yeah. You started your presentation by saying migration to the cloud. While on the other hand, you are actually seeing all the major cloud providers, Azure Stack HCI, Google Anthos, AWS Outpost, all of them are actually trying to get into on-prem space. So there must be some genuine reasons and things that are not covering over here. It's easier said than done in terms of the cloud migration. Something as simple as you spoke about failover, right? How do you test a failover without actually disrupting production workflow? And there are solutions that are existing in on-prem world. So you put that in one line, right? Alignment between ops, business, architecture, and there is this infosec. And all four of them they operate in 4 different channels. So how do we actually tackle that problem with the cloud migration?
So that is something we call it edge computing. And this is a pure compliance requirement. Reason I'm saying that one of the companies I'm working, they need to move to cloud in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, we do not have Azure. But they have decided as a company to move to cloud, and they're hoping sooner in Nigeria there will be a cloud, that is Azure. So they are now moving into Azure Stack because the whole movement will work like an Azure movement. And once that Azure is available, they will switch that deployment to Azure. That's the reason they are using Azure Stack, right? And Azure Stack are generally used in locations like mid-sea drilling, where you don't have internet, you use only the satellite connection, and it's not very cheap option for you to connect to cloud, right? You cannot run cloud application for those workloads needed in those chips, right? So you need some local cloud, right? So that's a private cloud. So that's when we call it hybrid cloud, right? That's a different discussion. So that's the reason why they go in that mode is mainly a skill set available within the organization, right? So you build up a practice, cloud practice, and that cloud prep is capable of doing the hybrid deployment. But if you need to maintain the system center skill set within an organization, you have to have a different team, right? Because system center doesn't work with Azure, right? So it's two different skill sets. So that's the reason they are moving in that mode.
So I think because you very specifically focus on the cost aspect, before you even get into and start leveraging the benefits of the cost, and that is very debatable. We can have very detailed offline discussion on that. There is a huge upfront cost in terms of migrating the app.
Yes.
For example, in Duke's TurboTax, classic example, they spent about 3.5 years and $300 million to migrate the TurboTax for cloud work, right? So there's a huge cost, upfront cost that you need to pay before you actually migrate your app to the cloud. It's way easier said than put in a single line. What's the
Yes.
difference in that?
We can have a cost discussion, and just I gave an example of extended support. That means your legacy operating system. I gave an example about Windows Server 2012. Companies continue to use Windows Server 2012 by paying hefty amount to Microsoft as an extended support. We have calculated the cost of moving that workload into Azure is way cheaper than maintaining that on-premises. So that's the kind of buy-in. So it's a case-to-case basis. There is no single silver bullet available to really make someone happy about the cost. And generally businesses are not happy to expend additional amount when things are working. So you have to make them understand. So as I said, like if your company IT strategy, CIO, CTO says that we need to move to cloud 100%. That's the strategy. And you have to follow that. And that's when the cost discussion goes sideline. It's an investment, right? So for any business, you need to do the big investment. Now, while saying that, you need to also say that what is the lifetime of that application, of the business. If the business is going to get sold in next 3 years, you're not going to spend money on moving to cloud. You'll probably end up having that application on premises with an extended support because there is no point investing on it because we are anyways divesting that part of the business. That's a decision which business needs to take, right? But if the business is a long-term strategic, like renewable energy, green energy, then you will definitely invest on it because you are doing that business for the first time, right? And you probably have started 5 years ago, build it for on-premises, but you have a long-term vision. 2025, you go carbon neutral. That's the motto of a CEO level, right? And you get a CEO buy-in for that project, right? Because it's a strategic project. So it's a case-to-case basis how things will be tackled, right? Not every cloud migration is easy and everybody will not give you money for that, right? It's not going to happen. If somebody thinks that way, even if it is a company strategy, it will not. As I said, like you might have found an alternate to that application as a SaaS solution. It's already available. So you move your data in that SaaS solution, don't maintain an application, and then kill that eventually. So you don't move to cloud in those cases. And cases where the compliance is important, like HR data in Middle East should not go and sit in Europe, right? If you decide to do that compliance thing, you have to stay in the Middle East in your own data center in whichever country it is right today. So it is case to case, always like that. And then there are a lot of scheduled tasks and scripts which runs in this kind of data center, right? For cleanup, for making the updates and all these things. So you can put them in automation, account, right? DevOps, logic apps, like serverless way of doing things. Even container also comes in and becomes handy in a lightweight manner. So you can do that in a much more cloud native way than doing it in a traditional way of having a management virtual machine. However, that you still need a virtual machine because you use certain tools which runs in a GUI interface. So you can have Windows 10 or Windows 11 machine in Azure to run those tools. So there are tools I've seen which needs to run for management and maintenance purpose because that collects certain amount of data and puts it into some backend system. You don't, but eventually you have to think about it, right? Should I continue to run it as is or change bit and piece and eventually retire that mode of doing it into a different kind of virtual machine. Now VM sizes. I have done, let's say, I probably have written for thousands of VM sizes what could be the Azure equivalent to it. What I faced as a challenge is that I don't find apple to apple mapping, which means that in Azure you have a ratio between RAM and CPU. So if you have X amount of RAM, you can have only Y amount of CPU. You cannot increase one and stay with one. So if you have a 32 GB RAM, you can only have X amount of CPU core. If you have 64 GB RAM, you can have X amount. But in on-premises, it is quite dynamic, right? And what I really ask or challenge the team is that the VM, which we cannot find the exact match, can you tell me what is the usage pattern today? Are you going to use it? Are you using it 100% today? Can you optimize it? So a lot of time I have seen they are underutilized. And in those cases, we can straight away reduce because cloud is scalable, right? So at any given point in time, we can increase. But going with the uppermost capacity doesn't give you a cost benefit because when you can reduce the cost, if your VM is over a period of time you utilize only 15%, then why to maintain that heavy VM? So you can reduce it, right? You can have a lower SKU and then still can run the same workload with the same performance expectation, right? So that's the optimization option we have available here. And then there are a couple of ways you can save the cost. We will not talk about it because they are very specific to things like that. And then what is the purpose of the VM is important. Because in every cloud, there are different types of virtual machines for different kind of workload. When you run database, it is generally IOPS intensive. It writes a lot in the disk. So you have an IOPS intensive virtual machine which is having a lot of capacity in terms of IOPS for the disks you are using there. Versus if you run SAP HANA kind of solution, which is an in-memory database, requires a large amount of RAM to store the data. Seems very scary, but that's how they do it. So you need a large RAM, and that is a different type of VM family, we call it. Similarly, for application, you can use general purpose virtual machine. For image analysis kind of data science activity where you need to render a lot of images, go through image algorithm, you probably need NVIDIA GPU based machine. So you get a different VM family for different kind of thing. So you need to choose the right family because every family will give you the similar size. But if you go ahead and choose all of the general purpose VM, probably you are not getting the benefit of cloud for those specialized workloads. So call them out if you have a specialized workload. So I always ask that what they do. What is this application does? Because I don't see what this application does when I see the Excel file, right? So if there's a simple website and I go with the general purpose, if it is something which requires a file processing or a image rendering, then I go with a NVIDIA or N-series machines, right? So all those things matters. And then storage servers are not required. You don't need to move your storage server. Storage has got a fully PaaS available, and in fact the whole cloud runs on that storage which we are talking here, right? So it is very reliable storage solution available which you can move it, and there are multiple different ways to do that. And replication is pretty easy. You can even decide to have a geo replication, which means you can create replica of the same storage file into another region so that you can even attach it to your CDN to have the local copies for the end user. So if you have a website which has a lot of medias, you can put it in storage and say that enable that storage against the CDN, so it will be spread across CDN endpoint across the globe beyond number of Azure storages, right? And then it will give you those things. So there are many different benefits plus cost benefit. And depending on what is the data, how frequently you use that data, you can choose a storage. So we have a cold archive storage, which means that on archive storage is you dump the data, you never look at the data unless there's an audit and something is required. You go ahead. So the storage cost, cost of the size is very nominal, but the transaction cost is really high, assuming that you are not going to frequently use that. If it is a transactional storage, which means that you frequently drop file over there and read file, you probably go with the hot storage, which means it's always up and running. Cold is something like very infrequently accessed file. So you choose that right kind of storage because it will help you save a lot of cost if you do so. Monitoring. I don't know how much important it is because if you don't do that, you will be asked by the ops team, and what is your monitoring solution? Because they need a dashboard. They need to see how your application is working. So monitoring is something like a security kind of level of discussion. So you need to have the monitoring in place. And as I said, monitoring becomes complex because you may have a SIM solution already available. How do you pass your log files into that SIM, and that log is log when things go wrong? Then there will be a trackback and hunting, and that time it is required to have. So you should have that in the system, and for ops, single pane view is the most important thing. So tell you, can you share the dashboard with me because I want to put it in my dashboard. And I've seen companies having their ops with multiple screens, with multiple different business critical application dashboard running, because that's how they monitor the health of the application. If it is a transactional application and needs no downtime. Alert and notification is something which you can always configure, which means that you don't have to look into the screen all the time. You can have a notification saying that, hey, there is a delay or slowness in this transaction. Then you probably trigger and request to manage that. It's an opportunity for you to do a network segmentation. I have seen on-premises application doesn't have those subnet very frequently used, which means they put everything in the same subnet. You can probably decide to have subnet for different things. That helps. And not only that, you can have a policy. Why we do that is mainly because we have something called in Azure called NSG rules that allows certain amount of, let's say, IP addresses and etc. So you can define those at the subnet level and tell that I will only allow port 1433 from this IP range because it's derivatives, right? So that's a kind of something like you can define. If you put everything in the same subnet, it's very difficult to do all those things. You can now have large IP spaces because Azure provides you private IP ranges. You can improve the security of your network by enabling additional firewall rules, etc. into that, and you can actually improve your network how it is today on premises, because a lot of time we are not allowed to touch that. Now it is a software-driven network, and you can pretty much control everything the way you want. So have a good network design. That's my recommendation. With a good, knowledgeable network engineer to help you understand how it should be done, right? Because it's a complex thing, and it is a one-time activity. You cannot change it. Now, web application firewall, WAF, or load balancing is something which is in on-premises done in a virtual machine. So you basically go ahead and install something, maintain a virtual machine with a Barracuda firewall, right? And then you do all these complexities, create a replica, cluster, DR, and all these things, right? You don't need, you have a first-class service available as a load balancer in every cloud, and web application firewall is built in, so use them, right? You don't need to. Now, I've seen it not always it is easy to discard what is there on premises. Sometimes you need to carry because of the certain feature is not available in the cloud. So when you need to discard something which is already running, you have to make sure that all the features which is being used are available there. And we have seen that in our exercises that there are certain areas where we need to really continue to have that solution as is in the cloud by moving that virtual machine, lift and shift. Now, Active Directory Federation Services, which is commonly used everywhere, which requires minimum 4 servers. Okay, today, if you have to build that, you need to build the 4 servers, and if you have a DR solution, you need to build another 4 servers. So that will be 8 minimum virtual machines you need to maintain and manage. Instead of that, you can move into cloud system. It is so easy to say, it's not easy to do. Why? Because there are applications configured for ADFS. So you need to change that configuration detail and also go through a whole lot of testing process to make sure that they respond the way it used to respond in cloud system. Now I've seen gateway for single sign-on, even with Active Directory Federation Services. In those cases, it's easier because then application level, you only connect it to the gateway. And gateway connects to either ADFS or Azure Active Directory. So that configuration is only one time, rest all remains the same. So if you have that kind of gateway mechanism for single sign-on via ping-fed, just an example, you can actually continue to do that pretty easily and change the actual Active Directory Federation services or Active Directory behind the same quite quickly, right? You don't have to go through all the application. Now VPN is commonly used for internal only applications, right, where the VPN is bandwidth. There are modern way of connecting like VPN, like point to site in Azure, which is one of the ways. I'm not talking about Express Route, but Azure Bastion is another way you can connect to the virtual machine like a VPN way, most secure option. So you need to do an early assessment of the existing VPN solution and what is the business need. Can you live with the Azure Active Directory like end user machine solution and continue to leverage that? And then I have only 1 or 2 slides. The management server, I talked about a bit about running scripts, etc. So you can have management servers for management activity, where you can think of like backups and switch management, all these things are not required in cloud anymore. So most of the things you can get rid of that, use native automation to do anything which is automation, like non-production developer machine needs to be shut down 8 p.m. every day. Okay, that's the policy. Then you save a lot of cost. You can do it through automation, through logic apps, through Azure automation, right? You can connect to Azure and do that. So with this, I want to thank you. I know I can spend a lot of time talking about those things, but these are the general things which I have seen coming back again and again in the discussion. So I thought to share any question. Maybe one or two. Yeah.
So with respect to his thought, right? So I'm seeing right now the industry is moving towards a hybrid cloud. Maybe it's a bias towards my company, but I'm just saying because people are moving from public into hybrid. Is that really a movement happening, or is it just a thought process coming to me?
So by hybrid, what do you mean? Do you have a presence on premises
Yes.
as well as in the cloud?
Yeah.
Yeah. It could be a reason because certain.
Hybrid can be that also, like half services I am using Azure, half AWS, and another half I am using GCP.
Sometimes they call it multi-cloud.
Multi-cloud hybrid, like they are saying that it is a mix of many.
Hybrid is different. Hybrid is somewhat public cloud and all.
So generally by hybrid, we understand that you use a public cloud, it could be any cloud, it could be multiple cloud, and then you have on-premises presence, which you control, your data center, right? And then the multi-cloud is a strategy for many companies because this cloud company, they can go down in demand. So tomorrow if Microsoft shut down their business, now what happens to your application, right? So that's a company's level strategy you take, that I should be able to create an application in such a way that I can move it to any other cloud, right? So that's a multi-cloud strategy. But you can also combine multiple cloud, but I have not seen a good success of having, because integration is not seamless in multiple cloud kind of scenario. Hybrid cloud is something which is there, and it will be there because of many reasons. One is that certain workload, as I said, doesn't have a budget to move. Then you have a data which is very sensitive, which cannot move to cloud, especially in the banking kind of solutions. There are political guidelines which does prevent you to move your data to cloud. In those cases, people still need to continue to have certain workload on premises. For example, with Azure Windows Server Active Directory, which is the heart and soul of your authentication system, stays on premises. So for that, only that, you still need a few servers, right? So that's the hybrid model.
So the industry is moving towards that?
I have seen mostly, yes. They have a mix. It's only born in the cloud kind of company which doesn't have any presence like
Bigger enterprises are
correct.
but
But any old business, which is a 50 years plus, they still have on-premise presence because they have to maintain a balance.
Because if you see the pattern or the products which is coming from all these cloud vendors, right now we see that mix of this multi-cloud, right? That one is coming. We to say the hybrid cloud technology is coming a little bit greater than the other public cloud services. Thank you.
So how basically in 2021 January, Parler got removed from AWS and the timeline was literally 24 to 72 hours. Like that happened literally for a public facing application which was a challenge for them. So you as an enterprise like an Azure advocate, so how often do you see this thing happening which are often influenced by politics and then applications are taken down? Does it happen quite often?
See, there is a due diligence before launching any service, right? Where the policy can change. Russia can attack Ukraine. Things can happen, right? Politics can change, right? Any point in time. And if the new government says that I don't believe in that policy, let's scrap that policy and bring in new policy, you have to change. So this is very difficult to say when things will change, but before any cloud vendor launching any service, they go with all due diligence to make sure that they follow all the guidelines, all possible guidelines. It's a huge team of people who are involved who are not technical, okay? Involved landing a service as a public service. So it is not like somebody likes something and builds something overnight and releases that, hey, you have a SQL server on PaaS, go ahead and use it. It doesn't work like that. So, but again, as I said, things can change. Politics, so Trump can become Biden can become somebody else, then they might bring in new policies. Then what will happen next?
So will this multi-cloud protect, do we have any strategies? Because I'm not aware, will using multi-cloud protect those things that we can move it quickly?
It depends on the application weight. So if you use too many cloud native stuff, that means the vendor specific stuff, then it's not easy to move. Let me tell you the story. If you use something which is a very generic, like cloud native, like a container based solution, then the additional overhead of maintaining, managing will come to you. But at the same time, you will be flexible. What if one cloud goes down, I can move to other, right? So it is a balance between these two, right? So whether, yeah.
For the landing zones, are there any off-the-shelf software available?
So for Azure, yes. For AWS, yes. I'm not sure about Google.
What's the Azure software?
So there is a cloud, I will share you the link. So there is a cloud landing zone available, cloud adoption framework we call it.
Okay.
And that gives you a set of scripts, policies for different industry. You can start from there and then start enhancing that. And they are available as a public report. We have it. So you can pick it up and then start deploying. It has a management group and all these things structured.
So does that need policy? Much more than that.
More than that. Policy is one part of it, but beyond policy there are many things.
On the SSO side, you mentioned PingFed. What other solutions do people generally try?
So I've seen PingFed mainly, but Azure Active Directory is good enough for SSO. Right? One challenge is with Azure Active Directory is that a lot of company I've seen uses smart card authentication, which means they are company ID, they punch in with the laptop. That doesn't work natively with Azure Active Directory. So for that they use third-party thing for a single sign-on. That kind of multi-factor is not present. We only have an app-based or call-based multi-factor.
I have one. It may be out of context as you told the CO2 emission. So what is your take on like all the companies moving their servers to the cloud native, whether it will serve the purpose of CO2 neutral or keeping the servers in their individual internet?
See, there are a couple of, I think, three level of discussion in the sustainability kind of conversation, right? So this is the second level of discussion where you have a supply vendor contribution to your carbon emission, right? So when you deploy an application to Azure, it's a Microsoft who is emitting the carbon to the environment, right? So Azure gives you the CO2 report. We give you the sustainability report. So for your subscription, how much carbon emission happened there is a dashboard available to you. So you can get that and punch in with your annual report that this is my carbon emission, this is the cloud carbon emission because I'm doing cloud, XYZ subscription. So it will tell you that detail, even if Office 365 also has that. And then you have the third level, which is most complex, which is supply chain, right? So we're not talking about that. But by moving into cloud does give you some benefit. It does. And that's the reason why most of the companies are moving.
How much time it takes to move, what is the maximum time it takes to move all the device to the cloud?
Depends. If there is a business push, it can happen very quickly. It is just a matter of time to do it, right? But if there is no money, no business interest, then it takes very long time. In my opinion, sometimes more than a year to really make them say yes, it takes that long. But certain times I've seen that companies acquiring other company has a on-premises data center like Polaris, and they have to renew the contract, and renewal generally is a 10-year renewal, and it's a large amount of money, so they say that do overnight. Okay, so it's just 6 months, everything goes up. And because they don't have to renew for 10 years, that's why they are so fast, right? So that agility is all about money, right? Where they still can afford, and if there's a good, doing good kind of business, they are happy to pay anything, everything they don't. It's not their headache, right? IT is not something business is worried about. It's only the strategy of the CIO and CISO is about moving cloud. For business, I'm earning money, my revenue is fine. Why should I bother what I'm running behind the scene? Because that's not, I'm not IT company, right? At the end of the day. So you will find this kind of debates here happening here and there.
Do you yourself feel a strong competition with other players like Amazon or VMware in this enterprise cloud field, or you see Microsoft as a leader here without any strong competition from other vendors?
No, we do have competition. So like as I said, like it's a strategy at the company level. So it is decided where they want to go.
Oh.
Right? It is not an RFP level discussion which we are making. It is after RFP, it is decided that they will go to cloud, then this discussion comes. But we do have, let's say, competitions across the board depending on what is the preferred choice of their vendor, right? If the core system runs on a specific cloud, naturally, even if they have a multi-cloud strategy, they'll tend to move into that cloud because integration becomes seamless. Right? If you stay in the same building, it becomes easy to navigate, right? Rather than staying in two different buildings. So I have seen those cases also, but wherever they decide to use Azure, there is no other discussion like, let's see how AWS or GCP works. Because it's already decided, right? So it becomes like much easier. But there is always a fair competition.
If the application is not really architected, so many of the features of the cloud may not be useful. For example, it's a monolithic application, you cannot even take out a part and scale it out, right? So if you have to re-architect, it will take a very long time to...
Yes. So that is what we call as modernization. Right? So application modernization takes time. Yes, I agree with that.
How do you approach your application modernization?
So application modernization approach is generally taken in bits and pieces. Sometimes they say that I don't want to use my legacy application anymore. It's a 15-year-old C#, .NET, SQL Server application I don't want to use. So I want to use all modern cloud technologies. I will continue that application. I will build something modern, like using a nano service, not even microservice, nano service with web APIs, maybe Cosmos DB as my database because my data is very, not very specific in such that I'm getting a lot of data from different vendors, so I will do that. So they then run parallel thing, and then probably take a couple of years to build up that functionality because it's very old. And depending on the complexity, it takes long, right? And sometimes modernization could be like just the part of your application can go in a public database, like PaaS database, like SQL Server can go in a SQL environment, which requires no change for your on-premises. And then application, if it is a simple web-based application, even I have moved classic ASP application in app services without any changing. Right? Without any change. You don't need any change. So you can move it. Just a file copy. Right? If I don't know the right IIS. So you can drop it there. And then you are pretty much modern application without making any changes. Right? So it depends on the assessment, right? So how that application is written, what is the functionality, right? If there is anything which is stopping you to go as a distributed application, then you need to change. If it is not, then you can move it as is. Especially web-based application is.
What do you want to tell about some who are really concerned about the data shape between the other instances?
Sorry?
For example, some companies actually step back for migration due to security concerns.
Yeah.
Because the data might be living with some other instances in the same way.
Okay, no, you have dedicated options for PaaS, platform as a
So
service.
is there any segregation when we have to step back and see what data we have to really put it in the cloud?
No, this is a valid concern. So there are scenarios I have come across, and there are options available for you to go with a premium tier, which is a dedicated. So you get a dedicated pool for yourself. There's no one else can use that. So it's your machine. You decide what is the size, how
At
much.
that time, the cost is same as what we have.
Yeah, the cost will increase, but the management headache will go down. You're not managing the
So
servers.
on-prem solution would be a better. Or
If you have decided to move to cloud, then it's a cloud discussion. If you are still in a dilemma between cloud and on-premises, there is a different discussion.
no, because this point actually brings up on-premise point.
Yeah.
Because the security point, okay, I want to keep my.
Yeah, there are a lot of scenarios where your application should not go to cloud because of the compliance guideline, and you stay on premises. It's not a technology discussion anymore.
One question. 4 years back, we did lift and shift to VMware. Okay. And now we are hearing the strategy has changed and we have to go to Azure. So these 4 years, we spent our time moving to one vendor. Now we are moving to another vendor. And it is not container as a service. Let's take Pivotal example. So we are deploying our artifact. Pivotal is taking care of all this, creating those containers and lines. So now we have to re-architect and bring in that container as a service. So why my organization did not think of these scenarios 4 years back?
that's
I'm not asking you an answer.
that's a
but-
specific question for your organization. I don't think
No, no.
you can answer
You
that.
might have seen these examples I'm asking, like they change their strategy after certain years. So where is the problem? Why they go, I'm not talking about the cost. Other than cost, what factors are involved?
No, I can help you with that. I think I face
So maybe you could kind of have an offline discussion.
We are running short of time.
So one more thing. So while doing a migration implementations, there are two. I mean, one of the ways you do a big bang migration where you identify that all of these modules are to be migrated.
Ask question. Continue.
So all of the modules are to be migrated, and you take. Thank you. You do a 6 to 8 months spent in migration, and then you do a big bang migration of a day where you cut over your on-prem and do a cloud switch. Now there is another way where you can go module by module migration, where you pick up few modules and then go migrate.
Yes.
Which one would you prefer, and like any specific reason?
So piece by piece migration I have also seen, like some stays on premise, some goes into cloud, but they do have express route connectivity, which means that your network latency is very minimal. It's like local, right? Because you get a 10 Gbps network speed, right? If you do not have that kind of connectivity between on-premises and cloud, moving a part of the larger application may slow down other part of this application. So if your database is there, application is over there in Amsterdam, then it might take longer time to communicate, right? So that also something is a consideration. If you have an express route, which is a high speed network traffic, which is secure between your data center and Azure, then you can go with this part by part migration.
Okay. Thanks, Wriju. Thank you for